Hello there and welcome to my YouTube channel called Shifa. My name's Matt and in this video I'm speaking about the philosophy, the thoughts and the ideas that you need in order to heal chronic illnesses. In my first two videos I spoke on the subjects of belief and action, and in this video I want to speak about the importance of learning in the process of healing a chronic illness. If you're in a state of chronic illness and if you're new to chronic illness, if you've only just been ill for a short amount of time and you're just starting to see that there may be something that you can do in order to heal, then that is actually a very critical point in your healing journey, because when we're chronically ill we face a number of very difficult questions and we can either expect that someone will give us answers to these questions, or we can actually set out on our own and try to find the answers for ourselves. So before talking about this idea of learning as an idea and as a process that we need to go through in order to heal, I want to speak very basically about the word learning and what it means. And in the most basic sense, learning is taking in information. It's being exposed to information and taking that in and then coming to a point where we can actually use that information practically. So in the question of how this applies to chronic illnesses, it's like any other thing. You have to expose yourself to sources of information and you have to focus on that information as it's being given so that you can actually remember it and process it, and you have to take that information and start building your own ideas and thoughts about this thing that you're trying to learn. In our case, that's chronic illnesses. Thankfully, in this day and age, especially on Instagram and YouTube, there's a lot of great information about chronic illnesses, healing chronic illnesses, different approaches to healing chronic illnesses. So at this point in history, we can definitely say that the issue is not a lack of information, because the information is out there and it's very, very easy to expose yourself to a lot of good information on this subject. Naturally, depending on the complexity of your chronic illness, this differs, but there are always sources of information where you can find different methods, techniques, thought patterns, things that you can use to heal, which will apply to every kind of chronic illness. If you've already watched my first few videos, I should think you have a basic idea of my approach to healing chronic illnesses, especially the fact that healing chronic illnesses takes both a strong foundational belief that healing is possible, and it takes action, us actually going out and taking steps in order to heal. Essentially, learning is one of the actions that we have to take, but there are difficulties to do with learning, especially in the area of chronic illnesses, which have to be understood for us to actually be able to take on information and use it. The problem, as I said, is not that there is a lack of information. Usually it's that people are exposed to the information, but they don't know how to create the foundation in their own mind, which allows for that information to take hold and become powerful enough to actually drive us to action. And this is where we have to come to a more philosophical understanding about what learning is and why we have to learn and how we have to learn. And these are the questions that I want to ask and answer in this video. So the very first question that comes to mind for me is, why is it that there is so much information about healing chronic illnesses and yet so few people are actually able to take on that information, internalize it, use it, and then heal? And I think the answer with this lies mainly in the fact that before we're able to learn new and good information, real information about healing chronic illnesses, we have to first unlearn a lot of wrong beliefs and thoughts and ideologies about chronic illness and about healing, which has been given to us and embedded into us by mainstream media and society. Unfortunately, even now at this point in history, there's now been a long period of time over the last 10, 20, 30, 40 years where alternative medicine has slowly been gaining traction. It's been gaining respect, both among people who have a scientific approach to these things and among general society. And especially in the last 5-10 years, I think, alternative medicine has truly come to a point where many people accept that the general understanding that exists about healing chronic illnesses has been dysfunctional and has not really helped people, and that alternative methods generally are able to help people who are chronically ill and actually make big changes in people's lives. So with this rise of information about alternative methods for healing and things that people can do for themselves, we're now able to find a lot of good information online for things that you can do for yourself. But still, the reason people don't take steps in order to heal for themselves is because the old mentality to do with illnesses and disease, unfortunately, is still very strong in people's minds. And more than anything, the very first belief that comes from that old system of understanding about healing in general is that we need a hero, we need a doctor, we need some outside support in order to be able to heal ourselves. And that instantly cuts off any kind of pull we may feel towards learning how to heal. Because our very first standing point when we become chronically ill may be, I'm not meant to do anything myself, someone has to help me to heal. So we go to different places. And I'm not going to name any kind of system that we go to. It's simple. Anything we go to externally is something other than ourselves, and it's taking power away from us with regards to healing and giving that power to others. And if we're able to understand that we have this belief that we are not responsible for our own healing and that someone else should take on our healing and actually work to help us heal, if we are able to realize that we have this thought, that we have this belief, then we can break this belief with the truth, which is that with chronic illnesses, of course, it's possible to get help from outside, especially with different kinds of doctors and people who work in the alternative area of medicine. There's a lot of different things that you can do to try and find help. But the idea that we definitely need to take this help in order to heal is a wrong idea. And the thing that helped me personally to understand that old belief I had as well, which was that I need to go somewhere, I need to see someone in order to be able to heal. The thing that helped me break that was basically this. It was understanding that no one in this world, no doctor, no outside force, no other person in my life, not even family or not anyone close to me, is going to understand my experience as well as I do. And however much you try and explain your experience to another person, you're always going to come across the problem of if you're in a state of chronic illness, if you're dealing with serious symptoms, then that person may or may not have been through that kind of thing themselves. And if they haven't, then you have the problem of they can't actually completely relate to you. And even if they have, still they're not going to be able to understand your body and your experience as well as you do. And this was my personal starting position for understanding that I have to personally try to learn how to heal and what I can do to heal without needing some kind of external help. And I think a lot of people who come into a state of chronic illness find themselves in this position similar to how I did. And usually the reason is quite simple. We look for help outside and then we find that we're not able to find the help we need. Some people try mainstream medicine when they're chronically ill and they find that simply the doctors are not able to explain their illness. For example, in my situation, I was chronically ill with a number of different symptoms and the doctors told me, they said, you have anxiety. Here, take this anxiety pill. And at that point, that had no purpose for me whatsoever. It didn't help me heal, even in the slightest. And I believe that a lot of people find themselves in that same situation. And if you're in that same situation where you are now, I would implore you, please consider the idea that maybe no one can help you as well as you can help yourself. Because if you take on this responsibility of, okay, something's wrong with me, something has to be done, someone has to do something, I can do that thing myself, I can do something myself in order to heal. If you take on this responsibility, then you can begin a process of learning. And this is where we can philosophically define what learning means in the context of chronic illnesses. It basically means that you're already learning more about chronic illness than anyone else who isn't chronically ill, because you're experiencing this thing. An analogy which I think is very helpful to understand this is if you take a professor of history, for example, someone who has spent their whole life in academics, in academia, and their main area of study is World War II. The simple question for me is this. On one hand, we have this professor, and on the other hand, we have a man who lived through World War II, and let's say this man spent only 1 week on the front lines. Which of these men knows more about war? And I think this question relates directly to what we have with chronic illness, which is that a person can study chronic illness for all of their lives, and they can speak with thousands of people who have chronic illnesses. But if they don't actually experience that thing firsthand, then there is no way for them to understand the depths and the nuances of that specific situation. So our foundation for learning is this. We have to learn because we're already learning from our own chronic illness. We just have to learn how to undo that chronic illness. We understand the illness. We can slowly understand our symptoms. We can learn to communicate with our body, meaning that we can try and figure out what happens when we do what with regards to diet, with regards to detox and different techniques you can use to heal. You can start a process of communication with your own body, which is a part of learning chronic illnesses. So at this point, we can actually split the learning process of chronic illnesses into two. One of them is learning our own illness, meaning learning the ins and outs of what really is happening in our body. This might mean trying to research and understand exactly what illness we have, if it's a chronic illness, or it might mean learning to listen to our body and understand what's going on between our mind and body, how they're connected. So that's one aspect, learning our own body, learning our own chronic illness, whether we can name it or not, whether it might be something that you can find a name for. For example, if you have aches and pains all over your body, there's a likely chance that you're going to come across the term fibromyalgia when you start researching it. And you can say, okay, I have fibromyalgia. And that might be a part of the process of learning about your own body. And on the other hand, the other aspect of learning is taking on good information from good sources. To be able to do this, the only way that I found works is exposing yourself to as much information as you possibly can. However much time you have to give towards learning about chronic illnesses, learning about healing, learning about alternative medicine, the more time you have to give to these things, the more you should give to these things. You should sit down and watch videos on YouTube, start feeding your algorithm on Instagram so that it gives you good information. If you start going into videos on Instagram about these subjects more and more, if you start especially following these kinds of things in Reels, then your Instagram will start giving you good information in this regard. And as well as this, you can also research and find good books to read about chronic illness. For example, I can personally say that I watched thousands of videos about chronic illness on YouTube while I was trying to heal. Thankfully, in my own situation, I had the opportunity to spend a lot of time, pretty much all day, every day while I was chronically ill, just researching. And that paid off for me because I especially tried to expose myself to people who were saying healing chronic illnesses is possible. I eventually got to a point where the idea that healing chronic illnesses was not possible seemed absurd to me. And anytime I came across someone who would take a certain illness, whatever that illness may be, and say, this illness is not something that can be healed, my mind would remind me of the good information I found on that subject before, where people say, no, if you do this, this, and this, you can indeed heal this chronic illness. But as well as watching loads of YouTube videos, what I did was I also found a lot of good books about chronic illnesses and about healing, and I read those books. For example, one book which I can definitely recommend, which was foundational for my beliefs, were the books written by Raymond Francis. If you look up his books, especially I think the book was called How to Heal and Never Be Ill Again, something like that. If you find that book, for example, that's great information about healing chronic illness. That's only one book that I read. I read many other books and I tried to expose myself to as much good information as I can in order to heal. So to summarize this whole subject and bring it back to a general philosophy on healing, I would like to say that learning is a very, very important part of healing. You cannot heal a chronic illness without learning something. That may be information, or it may be learning something about life, learning something about yourself, learning something about who you are. In some situations, I believe that people simply have to learn something about who they are and learn to work through that thing in order to heal from their chronic illness. This especially is something that's very important in illnesses that have more of a mental and psychological foundation. But even if your illness is mostly physical and you're dealing with physical symptoms, you simply have to go out, you have to start researching and learning everything you can possibly learn in order to start healing your chronic illness. And if you start this kind of learning process, and then if you're able to bring this together with the subjects that I spoke about in my previous 2 videos, which is a strong belief that you're going to heal and taking physical action, a lot of action in order to heal. If you take action, believe you're going to heal, and if you continue learning what you can do to heal, why you should heal, how you should heal, what went wrong in your body, if you continue learning as well, then all of these things coming together builds a strong foundation in your mind, which will take you towards healing your own chronic illness. I hope that this video was helpful for you. If you want to see my future videos, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like this video if it was helpful for you. I will see you in the next video.